So if you were to, you've extensive experience working with pro athletes, and I know you don't have as much of a foot in the camp of what your average weekend warriors are doing, but is there something that you think, when you look at all the World Tour athletes and you think they all have these habits around nutrition, and I don't see these habits in Joe Public?
The ones I think are most consistent, and this is, I would say this is a recent change in the pros, which is, I think, is beginning to be reflected in Joe Public, is actually fueling their training well. So actually kind of thinking a little bit more about, do you know what, maybe I will take a gel out with me. I know I'm only going out for 75 minutes.
If you took a gel out of training, like I was driving for a French team in 2012, and I remember being in the break of one of these Coupe de France races, like 200k across gravel and stuff. Like, being in the break thinking, like, I actually have a chance here today. Going back to the car and saying, can I get a gel? The manager saying, no, you've had your gel for today. I was like, it's probably still happening. I have Stephen Barrett from As She Does Air on later in the season, the head coach. So it'd be interesting to hear an Irish guy's perspective on French culture there. And if that's, I'm sure it's changed a bit, but culturally, they were a nation that underfueled for a long time.
I look, it was tied to a lot of those cultural and systemic beliefs in cycling as a sport, right? Like that's kind of continental Europe cycling's homeland, right? So like I get where it came from, and it's one of those things that I think, like, you can technology has moved on, right? Bikes, like all the kit has definitely got better, but I don't think the magnitude of change that you've seen in the average power output and like the average speeds that the races are being done at now, like if you look at how quickly those have jumped, I don't think there's a correlation with the bike kit. Like there's a function of the way in which the guys and girls are training that's directly correlating to the ability to not only produce power at a greater watts per kilo, but also sustain it for longer durations. So, and I think, maybe I'm biased, right? I'm a nutritionist, I'm going to say this, but I think there's a huge element of how well they're fueling in training, which is now we're really beginning to see that translate into longer, more just in, you know, when you just look at some of those riders at the end of races and you're like, how the fuck are you doing that?
Well, did you see Pogacar's data from the Dauphiné?
Like seated, just like
7.2 watts per kilogram for 22 minutes.
Frightening.
So, and even a good snapshot of this was, if you heard the Geraint Thomas podcast last week, Geraint Thomas talked, there's almost a snapshot because G is finishing up this season. So it's like a snapshot of two generations here.
Yeah.
G obviously won the Tour de France in 2018, but he was saying at his very best power, best weight, that would have meant him doing 490 watts. And his very best, he could have sustained that for 8 to 9 minutes. Pogacar's doing it not at his very best in a warm-up race for 22 minutes.
Yeah, it's like frightening. But so I think that, like, so I started in World Tour 2018, and like a benchmark figure that you'd be looking at for a GC rider would be if you can climb for 30 minutes at 6.2 watts per kilo, 6.2, 6.4 watts per kilo, you're probably in the ballpark of, you know, depends on who shows up and who's in form, but like you'll be in the money for winning stages and maybe even, you know, maybe winning Grand Tours, right? Not anymore.
No, domestiques are doing that. Like I've
exactly.
Jay Vine's been on the podcast loads of times. Jay's doing those sort of figures plus.
Yeah, exactly. So, and honestly, like I'm so convinced that the fueling training and how that's aggregated over a number of years is a not the only, but is a big driver to that. And like, come back to your question before. Like, I think the general public, as they start to absorb that and see it and feel it, and we had a conversation about fueling, you know, grams per hour on bike. I honestly think I'd love to see some data on the average power output at a club ride from 5 years ago, and then 5 years in the future, and see if it's shifted, as you know, that correlation of fueling better during training has as well.
I think by and large, the move to better fueling has been a net positive. There was a time, especially when I was trying to make it as a pro, riding, coming up through the French ranks. They tried to turn everybody into a 62 kilogram climber, regardless of your build. I'm 6'3". I was never going to be a 5'2" Colombian, but going out there, I'm walking around at 80 kilograms now. I feel like I'm pretty lean. You know,
Sure.
I'm not ripped, but I'm pretty lean.
Yeah.
And I was racing at 68 kilograms in France, and my director was pinching me. He's like,
Yeah.
and you were hiding croissants in the washing machine, and the whole culture.
Really? I've never heard that. Hiding in a washing machine on the bus.
So we had, our apartment was above Boulangerie. So
okay,
the scent of these croissants.
I mean, what a horrible place to house bike riders. That's terrible. Sorry, go on.
So we'd go down and get our baguettes and our croissants in the morning, but the manager would come around like for a house check every now and then. He'd come looking through the presses, make sure you had no bread or no cakes. So we'd have to take them all, put them into a pillowcase, stuff them into the washing machine, and then put the dirty clothes in on top of them.
Wow.
So they're like spot searches, like the FBI coming on a raid.
Insane.
But around then, like I had friends riding for BMC, and I'm not sure if you've heard this one before, but BMC at the time, I'm not sure if it was, I don't want to tar the whole team with this, but individuals within the team were taking medication to decalcify their bones so they'd be a little bit lighter.
Yeah. Do you know what? It doesn't surprise me. I haven't heard that directly before, but like when I started 2018, I think it was coming off the back of some of the the worst nutrition stuff was kind of over, and they were sort of starting to, like, Visma was already a big driver of moving to performance nutrition at that stage. So like Asker Ukendrup was leading the nutrition setup there and really beginning to move things forward. So, but you know, when I came in, you know, it was like I was, you know, like heard discussions of, or heard things through the grapevine where it's like, oh well, can I get an arm sling for the off season? Because if you just have your arm in a sling, you get atrophy the muscles. Yeah, exactly. So, you know, and I was like, and it's actually, it's interesting. Like you have the Jonas Abrahamsson from Uno, who, you know, and like Olav, the coach there, who's like, actually, when you look at if you look at
Olaf Boo's the coach?
Yeah. So also he has some, you know, is helping to direct some of the coaching staff there, I think, and set some set some direction towards, like, you know, training philosophy and stuff. You know, they're like, well, look, actually, functional mass is like, when you plot it, it's actually really good for power output and durability, and you're less likely to get sick. You know, and it's all these things that you kind of go.
I remember having this conversation with friends who were riding a continental level in Belgium, and they were like, one friend in particular, a really good training partner of mine over the years, like 6'5" rider, and he's down at like 70 kilograms, 71 kilograms. And you're trying to say to him, it just doesn't mirror the demands of racing in Belgium. Like, you would be better off as an 80 kilogram rider who can blow it in the crosswinds, because you're still not getting up a Cat 1 at 70 kilograms.
Nope.
Like, you're not going to be 52 kilograms, you're 6'5".
Yeah.
But instead of that, we had everyone like as a tiny little rider, instead of saying, hey, there's different roles within a team. Like Ryan Mullen now is you know, good lad, been on show a few times. But Ryan's a great example of, if you just niche now, you can, it needs all types of different shapes. Ryan positions the lead out man. That's his entire job, to position the lead out man. Makes a really good living from it. He's a legit World Tour rider who's had contract 100%. After contract with just that. And he's an 80 kilo plus rider, but he can do 800 watts for a minute.
Yeah. And I think there's like, I don't know, again, whether it comes to, maybe you'd be better placed to answer this than I would. Maybe I'm going to ask you a question. But you know, like with the specialization of rider positions now, like, do you think that's more prevalent than it was before? Like, my understanding was, it was like you'd kind of have you'd have your, you know, your rouleurs, your bigger guys who would just kind of do some grunt work, keep the GC guys out of the wind on the flats, you know, like positioning, that kind of stuff. Which I feel now that you have specific lead out men for certain, you know, depending on what the kind of sprint finish is. Equally, you have climbers.
I think the segmentation of it is increased. I think before you were nearly dividing into leaders and domestiques. Now you're dividing domestiques into different brackets. Correct. Here's a guy who can ride the valleys well. Here's a guy we can use as a tool in the crosswinds. But the interesting thing that I'm actually observing is the evolution of an athlete within that segmentation. So the athlete who used to be, you know, say a Rafael Majka at the moment is normally Pogacar's last lad. You know, when Majka hits the front, stuff's about to go bad for everyone else.
You see everyone else go, oh, fuck.
Exactly. But as Majka loses that edge now, I think you'll watch him become third man.
Sure.
And maybe someone else will step up into that role. And Micah might evolve to the point where he's at the bottom of that segmentation, where he's, controlling early breakaways, or he's doing bottles earlier in the day.
I mean, I was actually going to say the one that just popped into mind was Wout van Aert for Simon Yates in the Giro.
The greatest domestique in the world.
I like put him up the road. That he was obviously in the break, and then Simon got to him on what was the name of the climb?
Finestra.
Yes. Got to him. And then there was I saw some, I don't know how true it was, but I hope it's true, some mad numbers that he did 400 and something watts for 12 minutes or something. I'm like, first off, he's clearly a very good bike rider, but also strategically, what a great decision that was. Actually, who have we got who's probably strong enough that deep into a Grand Tour that can go out in the break and still have a bit left in the tank to do this kind of job? And then hopefully, we'll bring Simon up and he'll make use of that, execute it perfectly, and climbed it in 58, 59 minutes.
And everyone was abusing Froome years ago, saying he was lit when he went up at 5.5 minutes slower than Yates.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that was I think that climb was the first time that they used SIS beta fuel when Froome did it.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, I think so. So that was they had people with bottles every kilometer or something like that.
That was your nutrition equivalent, and splitting the atom.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So I think James Morton would be the better one to talk about that. I think he was there and involved in the build of it.
We'll definitely get him on. I know David's spoken about bringing him over to get him on. This episode today has been supported by BIKMO Cycle Insurance. Insure your ride with BIKMO today, and they'll donate £10 to Trash Free Trails to support their work in protecting our planet. Head to BIKMO, BIKMO.com, and use the code ROADMAN to get covered and support our wild spaces. Terms apply.